Hi everybody, thank you for coming and welcome to Beyond, a programme of free and funded design and digital support for non-profits working with families in the early years and to support financial well-being. Today I'm really excited to introduce our third training session, how to turn data and insight into actionable ideas for adapting to crisis. We're very lucky to be joined by Simon Herzog, who's Director of AngleMap and formerly Head of Professional Programmes at CIID. I've got a couple of little notes from me before we kick off. So as participants, you can't be seen by panelists, but we do encourage you to use the chat function to make comments, share agreements, and maybe have some little side chats about the content. And you can ask questions throughout. Simon will be making some space for questions during his presentation, but also at the end. So if you could use the Q&A function, if you've got a question for him, and he'll answer those as appropriate. We're also going to be recording this session and making it available via the Beyond site later today. So for any reason you need to catch up or if you'd like to share it with your colleagues, that's also an option. And finally, if you have any technical issues at all during the session, just message me and I'll do what I can to help. But that's it from me. So I'll hand over to Simon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amelia. Pleasure to be here and nice to be here with you all. It's a shame I can't see you, but I trust you're there. And I just want to echo that it would be wonderful if you could use the chat and especially the Q&A function throughout to pop up any questions you might have. I'm going to be stopping throughout the talk to just give you a moment to type those in and to answer them as well. I want to make sure everything is relevant and clear. So the title of this talk is Turning Data and Insight into Actionable Ideas for Adapting to Crisis. That's a little bit unwieldy, but we'll unpack that in just a minute. Before we do, I just want to make sure I can give you a quick introduction. So my name is Simon Herzog. I'm the founder and director of AngleMap. That's an organization I started a bit over 3 years ago in order to help organizations, companies, and at times governments make better decisions. We do that through global research across borders, where we help organizations understand their stakeholders, customers, users, constituents better, and then we implement change through strategy and often through trainings in particular. And my background is that with trainings is having done about 70 plus trainings around the world. Those are often custom ones or public ones in different countries like Peru, Singapore, Japan. And for about 6 years, I was with CIID, that's the Copenhagen Institute of Interaction Design here in Denmark, where I'm currently based, doing these trainings around the world. And also at the same time, I work with a lot of startups. Since about 2013, I've been a close advisor to different startups in all kinds of different sectors, and essentially also helping them with the same kind of approaches that I'm going to be talking about today, which is all about getting insights and making better decisions that are actually based on real human needs. So let's start with some definitions, because that title I think has a lot in it, but it's worth to unpack a little bit. So when we say data, what we really mean is information you've gathered from research. And for those of you who have joined any previous trainings, then you will have already learned a little bit about how to do that and under what circumstances and how to best gather that information from your stakeholders, which could be your donors, could be the volunteers that work with you, could be any partners you have, anybody on the ground kind of carrying out your services. And the most important information is that which you can gather either by talking to them or by observing them in action, seeing how they behave, what kind of issues they run into. So all of that is what we will then spend this hour or so learning how to synthesize down into something really practical. One of those steps is creating insights, which are conclusions based on that information. And that's where we're really trying to go in much greater depth to understand what it is that we've really found, going from the really raw data to something much more concise that we can also share with other people that it's relevant to, and that we can then turn into something very practical, like new products, services, processes, and so on. So that's what we mean. We really want to share some methods by which you can get to very actionable things that you can actually implement. And what we're doing today is a pretty cognitively challenging kind of process where you're really taking something quite abstract and you're turning into something very concrete. And of course, the crisis element in the title is obvious. I don't need to explain that, but I think in general, crisis just refers to a time of change. And obviously we find ourselves in a very serious one now, but I think the same applies to any type of change, whether, you're short on funding, or whether there's a disaster of any kind or so. All of these things are going to affect your operations and the way you're able to run your charities, run your organizations and your NGOs. And the methods we're showing today are really kind of created and designed in order to work under any kinds of circumstances. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then synthesis is really kind of the core of what we're going to be doing today, which is that process of turning that raw data into the wisdom to know what to do, next. And I really like that word, the wisdom, because it's not a scientifically completely obvious way to get from A to B, but a lot of it is really about kind of trusting yourself and your experience and the things you're hearing from people and seeing. And we're going to put a methodology to all of that. So what is synthesis? Essentially, if you've taken any of the previous training, you will have seen the double diamond before. This is a visualization of design thinking, which is the process that kind of underlies the entire Beyond program here. And I won't spend too much time on it, but effectively we go from discovery to defining something to designing for it and then delivering it. And we do that by the main steps of research, synthesis, ideation, and prototyping. What I think is really key to keep in mind here is that at each step along the way, we're changing the way that we think in order to achieve certain outcomes. So at the very beginning, when we start to research, we need to diverge. We need to be as open as possible to different stimuli and inputs. We need to have, kind of be receptive to all these different bits of information that we might get. And then in the synthesis step, which is one of the ones we'll talk about today, we have to switch again to convergent thinking, which is much more analytical. Then we narrow things down. We've just gathered a lot of information that's very broad, and then we try to make sense of it and achieve kind of a definition of specific problems. And then we broaden out again. Now we've defined the problem very clearly. Now it's time to design the solution for it. But we'll start very general. We'll start with all kinds of things that come to mind. And then only in the final step do we converge again in order to get to the specific solutions through testing, which is what the next training after this one next week is about. So today we're going to be focusing on these two main areas. We're going to be looking at how to define a problem, how to do this convergent thinking process of getting from raw data to the very specific, and then how to broaden out again and how to have as many ideas that are as specific and practical as possible about them. So at this point, I need to say that it's design thinking, which is what's underlying this whole process, is a collection of tools. It's not a silver bullet. It's not the solution to everything, but it is, the way I think of it, kind of operationalized common sense. It's really a practical way that puts a methodology and a set of tools to something that smart people have been doing for centuries, as long as businesses and organizations, have operated in the way they do today. This has always been a practical way to solve problems. And as you can see at the double diamond, there's kind of a sequence to these tools, and they work really beautifully in sequence because they feed on one another. But it's also not necessary to do them all at once or to do them all even, in general. They also work really well when you pick just one or two of them out. They're still designed to stand alone and to still help you, even if you don't have the time or the resources to do everything throughout. And then just for practical purposes, I know some of you are in very small teams. There's the occasional person I know that's running their own organization just by themselves. It's still possible for you to use those tools. I will say it's most effective probably and easiest to do this in small teams of 3 or 4. That's generally a recommendation. But if you're by yourself or in a pair, still okay to do. And you can always maybe pull in a friend or a colleague or something like that from somewhere else to help you with just, an hour or so of one of these things. And you'll already see a big benefit from that. So just as an overview of what we'll be talking about today, the first step in going from raw data to something very practical that you can implement is clustering data into themes and categories. And from there, we'll go to insights, which is about determining the significance of these clusters you've just created, to opportunities, which is where we formulate these how might we statements. And then the answers of that statement, those statements will be the new ideas that will then be focused and that will actually make sure that they are relevant to what you're trying to do. So you can see how each one feeds into the next step. And the beauty of actually following the process, if you have the opportunity, is that any ideas you have at the end, you'll be able to trace those decisions and those ideas all the way back down the chain, oftentimes to a specific thing you heard from one of your stakeholders or a particular insight that you gathered while you were doing your research. So it's really nice when you can do it all, but again, it's also completely possible to do it just a bit by bit. And I also want to show you what that looks like visually, because of course, most of the time, I'm a designer, so of course, we've worked with tons of Post-its. If you've worked with designers before, you will have seen how this looks, but I think it's important to see just what that physically looks like when we're actually able to be in the same room together. So it might, you might start out with, oops, that went a little too fast. Try that again. So you'll start out with just putting up all your information on a board that you've gathered. So that might be individual findings from the field, individual quotes, ideally one per Post-it, anything you've heard in your research, anything you've gathered in your desk research. You want to get it just all up on the wall indiscriminately across your interviews, across your sessions that you might have had. And then the clustering is really the first step of the synthesis. So you're trying to put together any single Post-its, any single findings and quotes with others that share some kind of trait with them. And I'll go into how to do that in just a second. And then naming those themes is really helpful in order to start to make some sense of what's going on. And then the insights, that's where you kind of gather it all together, create a little bit of room, and you'll start to think about, okay, what kind of themes do we have here? Why is it that they occur? Sometimes there will be some that don't fit. You'll just park them off to the side. That's totally okay. Not all your research is going to feed into something that you end up actually changing. But those insights may come from one or more themes. And finally, the opportunities, that's a very iterative process. It takes quite a while to get that just right. So you might have to try a few times. But essentially, those are then the very, very focused questions that help you actually come up with those ideas that are going to end up solving the problems that you're facing. So before I go on, I just want to make sure if there's any questions just right off the bat that you have an opportunity to say them now. Otherwise, I think we can probably move on. Just want to check in the chat if there's anything. Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate that. Okay, wonderful. So themes is the very first step here. That's where that's really the first step that you can take to really start to make sense of a lot of raw data. And I know that feeling very well. I've been in it hundreds of times probably by now over the many, many years and many different projects of having just a wall of stuff, or even worse, just a head full of stuff and information that you've gathered over weeks and months that you just don't know what to do with. And so the clustering and themes is really the first step to make sense of those. And one of the best tips I have for that is to actually segregate your different types of information into different Post-it colors. So again, designers are huge fans of Post-its, but it's for good reason. I promise it's really worth doing. Because if you're able to separate out any of the quotes you heard in a conversation, so you might have had an interview, maybe you've stopped some people on the street, maybe you've had a longer sit down with one of your donors or so, you'd want to separate those out, one quote per Post-it, so you actually have an opportunity to cluster those and move those around, because in one conversation you will have heard many different things that might have, might correspond to different clusters. Perhaps if you were in the field actually watching, your operations running, or watching some beneficiaries of your charity perhaps take advantage of some of your services, then you might just have some observations, things you would have seen, smelled, heard, whatever it is. And then finally, as humans, of course, we can't help but make conclusions. We can't help but start to think about why certain things occur. And so those initial conclusions, those inferences really also deserve their own Post-it color, because we'll come back to those later and we can build on them as we go. And then what that will look like is often just a very large wall of Post-its like this. So this requires quite a bit of space, but actually at this point, I want to take a quick aside, because since we are in the middle of COVID, things don't often work like this. Most of us are not actually working out of our offices at the moment. So we have to use some alternative tools. And that's where digital whiteboards come in, which is fortunately something that has worked extremely well to replace this kind of physical wall where we're all able to gather around and move things around. So in case you've never used those before, there's three main ones that I'd recommend. There's Miro, which is my personal favorite, Mural, which is honestly very similar, and Google's Jamboard, which is a little bit simpler. It's a great way to get started. All three of those are essentially virtual spaces where you have just a big white wall and you're able to collaborate with your colleagues and your peers on adding post-its, moving them around, writing comments to one another. You can see where your collaborators' cursors are. So it really is, in a lot of ways, quite similar to the real thing. And it even has a few advantages too. So for example, here's a few clusters of post-its that we did on a recent project with the Red Cross that I was leading. And in those particular cases, we had about 30 people collaborating on a single board, which is way more than you would be able to have in a physical space. And another great advantage is all of these post-its are then also searchable. So you might recall just a single word or phrase from something, and you've got 500 post-its in front of you. You can type that in and find it immediately. And that's a feature I found myself missing a lot kind of in real life working with physical post-its where that's just not possible. And then practically speaking, this is what it might look like on your screen. In this case, I was running this workshop with about 30 people, of which this is one of the bigger groups that we were kind of separating out. And so depending on whether there's more talking or more board activity, you might share your screen space in different ways. So I had the Zoom meeting kind of up on the right and the board that I was running on the left. So in practice, this is obviously not ideal, but these are some of the techniques and how we've adapted to this crisis now. And it's actually, to my surprise, to be honest, has worked particularly well for workshops or for things like synthesis like we're talking about today. So to come back to themes, the best way to do this is to actually trust your intuition. And that's one of the wonderful things about this design thinking process. It's really not a science. It's much more of an art. And we're really looking for inspiration rather than evidence. So there's never going to be a single objective correct way of doing this. But the beauty of it is you are the experts at your own business, at your own organization, at everything you've been doing. You have probably years worth of knowledge and experience of your stakeholders, all your partners and customers and everything. So you're actually in best position to look for the single quote or the single post-it that you've just put up that feels the most interesting or inspiring. It's a great idea to pick that one up, put it on a free spot on the wall or the digital whiteboard, and just start to see and ask also your teammates, what else feels like it belongs there? Like what else actually looks like it would fit with that? And then you're looking to group and cluster those similarly themed quotes and observations based on a common trend. And sometimes there might be a single individual case that's really interesting that deserves its own cluster. Other times it might be bigger themes like security or like a feeling of comfort or a particular challenge that everybody is experiencing. So there's really no hard and fast rules, but that's also the beauty of the process, that it's really up to you to also direct that process towards what's useful to you. And if you know you want to focus on the really big fundamentals, then you'll be looking for those. If you know you want to just tweak a little aspect of your service, then you'll know at what level to kind of make those clusters. So the key thing that you'll keep hearing me say throughout this is that we're looking for behaviors, motivations, and challenges. Those are really the fundamentals of like what it takes to really solve a problem, to really make something better. And ideally, those clusters that you make are also going to be about behaviors, motivations, and challenges. And that just very simply means what people do, why they do it, and what kind of problems they face along the way. And those are the things that are most actionable, because oftentimes as service providers, we want to either change or encourage certain behaviors. We want to tap into certain existing motivations already and maybe harness them to create that behavioral change. And we want to help people overcome challenges, whether that's the beneficiaries of your organizations or the donors or the volunteers or anybody working with you. Those are always going to be the things that you need to look for the most. So just to give you an example, that I'll come back to in a little bit more detail to this case, but when we were working on this project with the International Federation for the Red Cross and Red Crescent, this was just briefly about psychosocial supervision. So they have, throughout their many sub-organizations, thousands of people who are providing mental health services in the field, and that's across the world in crisis zones and disaster areas, war zones. And each of those mental health workers is supposed to have their own psychosocial supervisor with whom they can share the challenges that they face and that help them kind of cope with the difficulties that they see. So from the clustering of all of those participants who were from all these different positions and places, One of the clusters that emerged included things like, I'm afraid of getting in trouble, and it's difficult to separate my responsibilities. This person was actually both a supervisor and a manager. And like the green post-it then says, my supervisor is also my boss. And somebody else said, I don't feel safe telling my manager personal things. So we sensed something there, and the group called this, this cluster power dynamics. So you can kind of see how that emerges from these different ones, and how you'd have different kind of elements of that coming through in these individual post-its. The title itself doesn't make a statement yet. It's just that is roughly what the theme here is. And another one, there was something about, by the time I have my session, it's too late, my supervision session, that is, I wish I could call my supervisor from the field, and a couple of others like it. And so the team came up with the inadequate timing title for that. So you can kind of see how that also emerged from these different ones. There's many different quotes here, but they roughly all point towards something about timing being a little bit off. So that's a great way you can start to initially make sense of your data. So before we go to insights, I just want to pause for a second for any questions. I would really love to hear any questions as we go, because I'll be sharing quite a few different tools. Of course, there'll be time at the end for a few more of those. But if anything's unclear right now, or if you have any questions about, for example, how to implement this in a particular situation, you're welcome to ask that now or at any time. I'll just be monitoring that Q&A. Okay, well, let's move on. It's never too late for questions. Insights are my personal favorite step of the whole process, because this is really the juiciest part of what the whole synthesis process is about. This is where we determine the significance of the data in the clusters. This is where we really learn what we found out in the field. And we turn them also into a format that's very shareable. So if you have partners, if you have anybody else working with you, the insights are the bits that are really wonderful to share to help them understand what it is that you're working on. I'll pause for a second because I see a question from Elisa. Chicken and egg question. Do you usually define themes starting from data, or do you start the research process to explore particular themes you want to address? It's a great question. Thank you, Lisa. It's a little bit of both. Initially, of course, you would have some idea of what kind of issue or challenge you are researching, so you would probably define your research questions around that. So without a doubt, there's going to be elements of those themes that are going to emerge from the types of questions you ask in the first place if you're doing interviews. But it's really good to still have the openness to just let other themes emerge, and you might have some ones that you don't expect at all come out of it. So it's a little bit of both. But of course, the more clear you are on what you're trying to learn as you go into the research process, the better the questions are going to be that you'll be able to ask. And that will, of course, also affect the themes you come up with. All right. So as we talk about insights, they're clear, deep, meaningful perceptions into human behaviors within a particular context. John Kolko said that. I would add to this quote that it's human behaviors, challenges, and motivations. My three, like the holy grail here, the holy trinity of what design thinking is about, in my opinion. Those are the three elements that we're looking for, and those are also the three things that we usually try to make insights about. And the way they work is just asking yourself, looking at that board and that you've just made, what is the given cluster about? Why is it relevant to the problem we're trying to solve? What does it mean? And the answer to that question can go on a larger post-it or a piece of paper. And they would essentially try to articulate in a concise way the answer to that question of why is this a thing? What does this mean? What about power dynamics is this cluster about? And from then you can ideally try to reflect multiple different elements. So, you're very occasionally there'll be a single quote that's so strong as to prompt a whole insight by itself. But more likely than not, you're going to be looking at multiple quotes, a single cluster, possibly even multiple clusters. Again, there's no hard and fast rules for this, but it's important to remember that it's your instinct and that of your team combined, ideally, that determine what's really going on here. And that's really, it's important to trust what you actually feel and what you already know. And so insights are this combination of things that you see in front of you that you've learned, as well as your own knowledge and your own experience, which is very important, since you've probably all been doing this for years, whatever it is that your organizations do. So just to give a quick example, several years ago, we were given the task by the Copenhagen metro system, that's where I'm based, to help them improve their system as they were expanding. And this is a couple of us doing some research on the trains. It's of course always best to do your research on location in context whenever possible. But for example, an insight that came up early on, but that wasn't so strong, you might have just seen in the picture, this lady was trying to have her bike in the middle of the train, not a lot of space for it. So a weak insight would have been, there's not enough space for bicycles on the metro. So that is true probably in most cases, but it doesn't really give us a lot of depth. So something much stronger might have been something along the lines of, many travelers prefer forms of transportation that allow for visual or other connection to the outside world. So in my opinion, that feels quite interesting. I don't quite know what that means yet for us, or what that means for the metro or the future of it, but it's interesting to note that nobody told us this directly. This didn't come from quotes, but it came from the observation repeatedly that whenever the train would emerge from the tunnel, everybody would be kind of craning their necks to look outside and being visibly pleased by what they were seeing and kind of having a sense of place for it. As well as hearing that a lot of tourists prefer forms of transportation like buses, where they can actually see where they're going, get a sense of place. Or another one, most travelers are not aware of alternative attractions along the route to the city center from the airport. So here in Copenhagen, you have to basically take a metro from the airport to the center. Most tourists only spend their time in the center. If you've ever been to Copenhagen, it's very beautiful things to see. But this insight actually came from us putting a map in front of people and asking them to circle the areas that they had seen and that they wanted to see. And this insight actually came from a conspicuous absence of any of those markings in that area between the airport and the center. So again, this is to show that insights don't always come directly from single quotes or even from clusters. They might actually come from the absence of something, or they might come from very kind of observations that don't quite fit into anything else. And then finally, practical one, most visitors from outside the EU do not initially have access to mobile data and rely on paper maps. So not super exciting, but again, we're describing a behavior, them relying on paper maps, and we're also stating why that is, because they just haven't had a chance to get a SIM card yet. And ideally, a good insight statement is drawn from several quotes, observations, and clusters, like I've said, and they should articulate a behavior, motivation, or challenge quite clearly. Should be a full sentence. It should stand alone. This is something that you can hand over to somebody else. This is something that you can bring somebody else in, one of your colleagues or peers, and put that in front of them and ask them, does that feel true? And maybe you can even ask them, why do you think that is? And if you can, then including the word because and the answer to that is really helpful to get to more depth as well from that insight. And oftentimes insights can also spawn additional insights. So if you ask why about that and then put that because on it, or sometimes you might be able to try to find the inverse of an insight. So if your insight is everybody is behaving in this particular way for this motivation, you could also make an insight about, well, nobody's behaving in this way, perhaps for that other reason. And that can also be useful by itself. And in that way, you can embrace this tension. And finally, you should aim to not be prescriptive. So insights are really made to represent the world as you understand it, as it is currently. They're not solutions yet. This is what we'll get to in the following steps. So before we go to opportunities, just I trust you guys will enter in questions as you get them. I just want to make sure that we have the time for them. So even if you do bring them up as I already go to the next section, that's okay. I'll just pause for them as we go. All right. So opportunities, this is quite exciting because this is where it gets from the very, this is the last step really of this very cognitively heavy analysis process where we're really narrowing things down. This is the last bit of distillation, if you will, where we go from these bits of information we've gathered and then from the insights that we've articulated about them to the really practical how might we statements. And these are the ones that are going to bridge the gap between the information we have and the things we can do about them. And that's where it gets quite juicy, I think. So those how might we statements, they shift the focus from the negative, the problem view, like the description of how things are, to the positive, like what is the opportunity that we can take advantage of? What is the thing that we can actually do about this? And we phrase them as a question very deliberately so that the answer, like any answer to that question, will be a focused idea that actually responds directly to whatever challenge it is you're facing. So by crafting good how might we statements, you will actually ensure that any ideas that you or anybody else comes up with are going to be relevant, they're going to fit into what it is you're trying to do, and they're actually going to be based on real data. And then finally, this is the bridge that carries us from that research phase to the concept generation phase. This is kind of where the double diamond comes to a point. And before I go on, Elisa, you had another question. How do you do effective research if you cannot be with the users to observe them? Yes, with COVID. Digital whiteboards work well. Any suggestions for tools to use for the research now? This is a problem we faced a lot this year, of course, that any researcher, any designer is facing, in particular now. But for example, in AngleMap in my organization, we focus already on international research, on kind of cross-border insights. So we generally have already developed techniques that are especially applicable now of doing remote research. So a lot of times we do this over Zoom calls, over Skype calls, and so on. We would just have 45 minute to an hour sit-down interviews with people. Whenever possible, we ask people to talk to us from the context that we're interested in. So if we're interested in their workplace, we'll take a call, from their workplace or their workshops or from wherever they are. And sometimes even if you have the time and the resources, we will send along certain probes or artifacts or anything that is relevant to the research to them ahead of time. Or perhaps we'll ask them to keep a journal for us. If we can't be with them over a certain period of time, we might give them a template for things to fill in over time to give us some understanding of what that process actually looks like. So the good news is there are still really great ways to get to really good knowledge and research, even remotely. But of course, it's not going to be as rich as actually being there with people and actually having them in front of you. And then there's a question from Megan. Do you recommend getting beneficiaries to film parts of their days doing different tasks rather than saying what we do, as we might miss some of those latent needs? Absolutely. So this is one of the aspects, one of the things that we do sometimes is ask them to do video diaries, just like little, recording little bits of their day. In general, this is actually a challenge that's as true for in-person interviews as it is for remote interviews. So this problem that people don't always behave the way they say they do is kind of a classic conundrum in design and in research. But some of those techniques can help very much with that. Like journals or video diaries or so can be really helpful with that as well. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for those questions, both of you. So moving on, actually, you can also see in the background here, this was a project in East Africa. The opportunity they came up with there is how might we make financial access points more localized so farmers do not need to travel so far? And you can also kind of tell where that, you can see the insights within that. So there's clearly a challenge around distance or, perhaps there's not enough use of the financial access points for farmers. And then the insight is maybe that's because they are too far apart or too far away from where those farmers actually are. So they're looking for ways to make them more localized as one of the opportunities so that those farmers can access them more. And for those of you in financial well-being, that case is probably going to be kind of relevant. But just briefly, the way to articulate how might we an opportunity statement is very simple. It's how might we act on an insight or more for a particular user typology within a certain constraint. And typologies, we don't have the time to go into that in detail today, but many of you will have heard of or done personas before. It's a very simple tool to essentially group together functionally similar types of users or stakeholders. Typologies are, in my sense, actually preferred because they're not so concerned with demographics. So we don't necessarily want to lump all the 18 to 35-year-olds together because there's very large differences between them. We're more looking again at behaviors, motivations, and challenges. So what do those people have in common? regardless of what their age or marital status or anything else is. But essentially, it's just about how might we act on this particular insight we came up with for a particular set of people, which you'll define as is relevant for you. And then the constraint is actually really important, because especially now in crisis times, but even in the best of times, there's going to be certain things that we have access to, certain resources we have, certain abilities we have to address a problem. And especially now, a typical constraint now might be, well, we want to do events, but we can't do physical events. So how can we engage our donors, to kind of keep up their donation subscriptions without having physical events for them? That would be an interesting opportunity that I think would be affecting many of you right now. So again, let me give you a couple of examples here. Too broad of an insight to come back to the Copenhagen example. How might we improve people's experience visiting Copenhagen? That's way too broad. You wouldn't even know where to start, and it's not really referencing any particular insight. So it doesn't really have the meat on the bone that we're able to sink our teeth into. Too narrow, on the other hand, is how might we create a Wi-Fi ticket machine for visitors? That's pretty much just an idea masquerading as a question. Might be a good idea, but if you answer that question with ideas, you're just going to come up with little changes, some details of the interface or about the placement or so. It's not really what we're looking for. But much more something like, how might we enable social travelers to bond with locals through shared experiences? That clearly addresses one or more insights about what it takes to bond with locals, and what social travelers might be interested in, and so on. So that's really much closer to what we're looking for here. And then again, to come back to the metro example, you've seen these three insights that I've said before, and the opportunity, the how might we statement we came up with combining those three is, how might we help independent tourists experience the outside world and discover new attractions along the way without having access to data service? So you can see how those two first insights come together in the middle part here, and the third insight feeds into the constraint. And I think that one was quite interesting because, obvious solutions to a lot of problems to many people are, let's make an app for it, let's make a website for it. But if your users don't actually have internet connection, then they're not able to download an app or access a website. And similar constraints come up through COVID, where you might do something as a physical thing and it's just not possible to have a group setting right now. So how can we achieve a certain objective without having physical gatherings? How can we do that while maintaining social distancing? How can we do that without creating extra costs for our stakeholders? Those are the types of constraints that you might have that will really help narrow this down. And then finally, good opportunity statements, like I said, reference one or more insights. They inspire action, broad enough that they can generate a wide range of ideas, but narrow enough that the entire team can understand what you're talking about. And they should be actionable enough to create something practical, and include a constraint ideally to keep it real. So Ellie, I'm going to pause for a second because I see you have a question here. Do you have any recommendations on how to best distill very large data sets into themes? Are there any free tools on the software you mentioned, like Miro, that pull out recurring words or ideas that can be found in the data? It's a great question. Sometimes you may find yourself with a very large amount of information. There are certainly ways to use technology to your advantage. Like, for example, in Miro or others, you can use the search function to highlight any post-it note that says the word, donation, for example. And you could flag all of those, and you could tag them in particular ways. So that could be an easy way to get started if you really have a ton of stuff there, to start to, kind of have some initial clustering based on that. But I think at the end of the day, there's no substitute for kind of the human filter of what these things really mean. So I think it's just worth kind of tackling it bit by bit, going cluster by cluster, going kind of post-it cloud by post-it cloud. So in the end, I think it's ultimately going to be up to you and ideally the team. The good news is, even if you don't really have a team available, this is something like, it can be a 1 or 2 hour activity where you can ask one of your friends or so to join. And even just having another set of eyes on something is really going to help make sense of a lot of information that can be very overwhelming for a single person. All right. Again, if there's any other questions, please leave them. Thank you to everybody who's asked questions so far. It's really great to see the engagement like that. So there's a couple more sections I want to talk about before we close for a little bit of a questions or discussion. And the good news is if you've followed along this far, then you've seen how we get from a lot of information, like we were just discussing, to something a lot more insightful and specific, to something that turns that around and turns into something actionable. And now we've got these questions in front of us. And ideally, you've narrowed down at every step along the way. So you might have had 200 post-its initially and turned those into 10 clusters and turned those 10 clusters into 7 insights. And then maybe you turn those 7 insights into 2 opportunities. And so each step along the way gets denser and denser and just contains within it more and more depth and information and relevance also to whatever it is that you're trying to solve. So each step along the way is an opportunity for you to kind of nudge the project towards the focus that you know is relevant, or if you're able to allow it to guide you to perhaps a problem that you weren't even aware of or an opportunity that you hadn't thought of before. I think that's where it really shines. But in any case, once you've got your opportunity statements, your how might we's ready, it's time to go to ideation. This is the fun part that everybody loves, to actually start brainstorming about what you might do about a given problem. So this is where we generate those new concepts. And the beauty of it is, again, if you're able to do this process step by step, any of those ideas that come out of that, you will be able to trace those ideas and the decisions you make based on them all the way back to your research. You will know that this isn't just something cool you thought of. This is actually something that you worked your way to step by step, and you can retrace those steps all the way back to maybe something an individual said or an observation you made in the field. And those will back you up, and those will make those ideas feel much stronger, which is both important for giving yourself the confidence that this is a good idea, as well as if you're pitching that idea to somebody, to your boss, to your teammates, to your donors. Those are the things that are going to matter and actually making that difference to convince them that this is worth going forward with. So I know that at this point, much of this process feels uncertain, and it is. And in the design process, whenever, for example, I do a project or a sprint or a workshop about this, there's always a moment or a day or so in the middle where everybody's kind of frustrated, and it's just frankly difficult to see where this is going. And every time that happens, in the early years when I was doing this, I was a little bit nervous about that. I didn't quite know if it was going well, but by now I think I have the confidence to know that this is an inevitable part of the process. There's going to be this uncertainty, there's going to be the confusion. And if you trust the process, which is kind of the mantra of design thinking, things will clear up, things will start to clarify. All those different directions will start to go and focus down into something that you can actually turn into a concept, into a design. And the good news is we're at this point in the process where it's actually time to kind of come up with those ideas that will start to then really lead you to that solution that you might actually implement. So in the double diamond, we've narrowed down to a specific problem. At the design point, we've got the opportunities. And from here on out, we're broadening out again. We're diverging with our thinking, coming up with as many ideas as possible. And there's some rules to this. There are 4 rules for the kind of the broadening out, and then 4 additional rules to brainstorming to help you collaborate. And those first 4 are probably the most important. Unfortunately, we've been socialized to not just say and not just kind of trust our instincts and say just what comes to mind. And everybody has got this strong filter on themselves that where most ideas don't even pass through. But when it comes to brainstorming, you're really looking to encourage wild ideas. You want to have as many crazy ones as you can, because even if your idea is completely ridiculous, there might be a seed in it that somebody else can pick up on that will then spark something much more valuable that really does make sense. So no idea is too weird or too crazy at this point. There's plenty of time to narrow them down later. However, you do want to stay focused on the topic. So even if you have a crazy sci-fi idea, it still has to answer that how might we question that you've asked in the previous step. And that really helps to make sure that we're not getting completely off track, but that actually everything we do contributes to the thinking about this particular topic. Then something that's very difficult for like the non-designers or non-artists to be visual. But the truth is, if you're able to sketch something, even terribly, it doesn't matter. I'm a terrible artist personally, but it still helps to communicate visually, to help, first of all, if you're looking at a wall and there's lots of just post-its or pieces of paper with text on them, it's very difficult to get a sense for what's even going on there. But communicating visually is just proven to be so much more effective in getting the point across. And frankly, it also just makes it a lot more fun and engaging. And you're really looking to go for quantity. So you want to have as many as possible because oftentimes it takes many bad ideas to get to the good ones. So briefly on the topic of being visual, everybody can do stick figures, but I'm actually a fan of the star figure, which is really simple. It's just about creating a 5-pointed star, putting a head on it, and they're much more expressive and really sophisticated in a way than the stick figure, but you can do all the same stuff with it. And another way is like when you do have text, make it easy to read, use all caps, use bullet points, and so on. And it's a question from Pin. When involving users to brainstorm ideas, how to encourage them to sketch? It's more likely most of them might not feel comfortable to draw. Totally true. My go-to trick for that is to have a little bit of a warm-up exercise for anybody that you're trying to involve in this brainstorming process. My favorite one of these warm-ups is called the wrong hand portrait. Of course, there is no wrong hand, but the trick is to ask everybody to sit down and to sketch a portrait of their neighbor to their left using their non-dominant hand. And this always trips everybody up because there's some people who are great at drawing and others who have never held a pen to draw since their childhood. But if you force everybody to draw with their non-dominant hand, so their left hand if they're right-handed, everybody's drawing will look equally terrible. It really levels the playing field, gets a lot of laughs. Then you can exchange them, hold up the portrait to the person. Sometimes they're still surprisingly good, but it really kind of helps loosen up and helps just prime everybody for using visual language for the rest of the session. So there's some fantastic warm-ups like that. That's my go-to one that I've done for years now, and it's really fun every time, and it actually works in kind of breaking that ice a little bit in the beginning. So moving on, with regards to quantities, there's something called crazy eights. This is a really grueling exercise, but it's wonderful for getting that volume, that quantity of ideas onto the board. So here we actually force ourselves or anybody that we're brainstorming with to come up with 8 ideas in 8 minutes. So that's 1 minute per idea if my math is correct. And that's extremely difficult because that's so little time. It just forces you to brain dump. And that's a super quick and efficient way to get all those bad or crazy ideas out onto the paper so you can build them later. So we just do that with 2 sheets of 4 ideas each. We just draw a quick image and we give it a title, and that's all there is to it. And later on, we'll put them up on the board and explain what they are. And then the final step to ideation is the sharing and building. Because of course, everything that has been done until now is wild and crazy and 1 minute ideas. They're not going to be very good. But there's another set of rules to help you get from those crazy ideas to the really good ones. And the fundamental aspect of that is building on each other. So you want to think, rather than rejecting somebody's idea, you want to say, okay, this actually makes me think of something else that we could do. Or what if we did this one and this one together and combine those in a way? And it's really important at this stage to defer judgment, both about somebody else's ideas as well as your own. The point is not to narrow down yet because you're still diverging, remember? And that's where I think it's really important to keep that type of thinking in mind that the double diamond visualizes. So at this point, you're still just trying to open up. There's plenty of time to narrow down your ideas later through testing, which is actually what the workshop next week is about. And also to only have, it's important to only have one conversation at a time so you're actually able to have a constructive setting. If you're multiple people, this can be tricky because it's a very energizing kind of process. And then whenever I've done workshops or sessions to run these types of brainstorms, I always strictly enforce that you're not allowed to talk until you've got something to show. That's actually really key because people are very prone to just having animated conversations about something, but it's just impossible to capture all the ideas that are flying around between people as they go. So it's really important to give people the time to actually sketch it out really quick, hold it up, and then you're able to have a conversation about it and build on those ideas of others. And then that's kind of what it'll look like. You'll be having lots of ideas, you'll be moving them around, you'll be adding to each other's, and that's ideally what you'll be doing at this point. So just a couple of things left, because now you've got your ideas. And now you want to turn those into actual concepts, because of course, even those ideas are not going to be of the quality or the depth yet that is actually going to lead you to a new concept. So there's just a simple step left where essentially we do another clustering, which is just like what we did before. You can also give themes to your ideas. You can have ideas, put them together from across different how might we's and cluster them by perhaps a certain approach that they take, or maybe they're all in a certain medium or channel, or maybe they all tackle the same kind of motivation. They all tap into the same kind of thing. And then as a team, if you have one, you're able to vote on what actually feels the most interesting and what you'd want to try first. And sometimes that will be determined by how many resources you have and what you're actually able to do. Other times that'll be determined by what actually feels the most interesting or promising. But in any case, then it's up to you to actually prioritize what fits best to our problem, to our particular challenge that we want to take forward. And just a very simple way to do that is then to turn it into this kind of concept development sheet where you just give it a title, you give it a subtitle, just so you can immediately say that to somebody. It's like the one-line pitch, essentially, of the idea, still keeping to that visual language of drawing the key touch point or the use case, like how might people actually use this in practice. And then I find it to be really helpful in setting up for that next step of testing, writing down immediately your biggest uncertainties about this particular idea. Like, what is the thing you're really not quite sure about? What is the thing you'd really like to learn about by testing this particular thing? And so ideas don't necessarily always have to be the answers to the questions or the problems that you're trying to solve. They can also be incremental steps of getting you there. So I have just one last little section left. There's a lot of information, I know, but I just want to make sure I'm capturing everybody's questions. Yeah, and so I think an issue that will come up a lot is how much time does this take? That's a very fair point to bring up. Generally speaking, when I run a sprint or a workshop, we do this entire process that I've just walked you through today in about 5 to 6 hours. And if you're focused, if you've got somebody who's able to kind of lead this process and who's able to kind of take people through it, then it's completely possible to do this in less than a day and go from a huge cloud of information to actually practical ideas that you're then able to start testing. And a question from Rach, do you have any ideas on how to motivate colleagues to take part? I often end up doing the crazy 8 alone. Yeah, so getting buy-in, and actually I have the pleasure of doing another training in a few weeks about design leadership, where I go much more in depth on this kind of question, how to get buy-in, how to achieve kind of greater engagement from your team, as well as other stakeholders. The sooner you can involve them, the better. I mean, you'll have to persuade them somehow to be part of any particular session, but if they're even sitting in on a single interview, they might actually perk up and listen to certain, they might pull out certain quotes there, and then they'll start to make their own insights, or they'll start to, as soon as they've been part of any part of the process, they will take some ownership over it. And it's actually usually the brainstorming that's the easiest, I find, to get people into, just because it's quite lighthearted and fun. One of the ways that you can always motivate people is by just asking them for help. You're asking for their expertise, you're asking for their perspective, rather than for them to do a chore for you. So if you can articulate why you want that particular team member to join you in the ideation session, if you're able to say, look, I know you have a lot of experience with this particular domain, like I would love to get your help on this, we really need you. Then if you flatten them a little bit, that usually does the trick to actually get them on board. So I just want to bring in one last, go a little bit deeper on this example with the Red Cross project that we were doing just recently with AngleMap. So this was quite a large project where the International Federation of the Red Cross, their psychosocial center, which is based in Denmark, is attempting to build an international standard for psychosocial supervision. So again, that's when mental health field workers themselves get mental health support so that they're able to cope with everything they're going through, but also ask technical questions like how do I deal with this particular case, or what kind of techniques or tools could I bring in for this very difficult situation that I'm facing. And of course, this was just a few weeks ago that we finished this project, but of course, this is extremely affected by COVID, and any of the challenges that supervisors and field workers would have faced pre-COVID, being already in disaster areas and war zones and, inaccessible parts of Africa or Nepal or so, are just exacerbated to an incredible degree by COVID, where it's just not even possible to fly a lot of the time, or it's dangerous to be in the same room as other people. So we were really looking for insights and opportunities from a lot of different field workers from different organizations around the world to get together and to share with us their experiences about what works, what are some challenges they face, what are some new things they've tried out recently since COVID started, and what are some ways that they've coped. And so this is where that screenshot came from. This is where we had people from, I think at one point in this call, we had people from Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, Iraq, Palestine, Nepal, Maldives, and the Philippines in one call. So this huge group of people from many different organizations, all sharing with us their behaviors, their motivations, their experiences, and extracting things like, from this power dynamics cluster I showed up earlier, one of the insights they came up with is supervisees are not as comfortable with supervisors who are also their managers because they don't want to admit to mistakes. So that actually turned out to be a pretty big, pretty juicy problem where some really good ideas came out of later. Or the timing one had something about some situations require real-time support that regular supervision doesn't provide. So we were actually able to come up with, I think it ended up being about 40 or 50 different insights that came from this research, and all of that is now flowing into the integrated manual for supervision that the Red Cross Psychosocial Center is creating, which is essentially going to be a best practices guide for the entirety of all their organizations and all their mental health workers in the field to find better ways to provide the supervision even in times of crisis. And since this project was entirely digital and remote, it was originally supposed to be physical workshops on location in Jordan and Ethiopia. We were actually able to talk to people from a lot more different countries and organizations than we would have normally been able to had we had to travel to those locations. So I just want to give you a moment to ask any questions that you might not have had time for so far. I just want to pull up as the final slide, just this overview again of what this process looks like, start to finish. Just to emphasize again, you don't need to do this in sequence. Each of these by themselves will be useful, but the more you do them in sequence, the more you will see the benefits of how they build on one another. So I hope that was clear. I'll just give you a moment for any questions that are left now. Of course, you're also very welcome to reach out to me at any point, either just for advice or for a talk, or if you have anything to work on, we're happy to do that. So that's my email, simon@anglemap.com. Be happy to work with you or to hear a little bit more about what you're working on. I know that many of you are facing some really difficult challenges now, but also that you're doing extremely important work. So it's a pleasure to get to speak to you like this. Oh, Rebecca, thank you. If you have one or two people doing the research and creating the findings, what's the best stage to start bringing other colleagues into the process? Generally speaking, the insight stage is the easiest handover point, because it's very difficult for anybody who hasn't been in the field, who hasn't been in the interviews, to come in and look at a giant wall of post-its. They're not going to be able to make sense of it in the way that you or the people who are actually doing those interviews or conversations will be able to. But the beauty of the insights is that since they're standalone, concise, full sentences, they're actually really easy to understand. And if they're well crafted, you can just show to colleagues just a small number of insights and they'll really get the gist of what you've been doing in your research. So that's the ideal point to start bringing somebody in if you're able to. All right, and I think that's good timing because I think we're just about at the end of the session, Amelia.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Simon. Really, really brilliant session, and lovely to hear some of the feedback that's coming through on the chat as well. And thank you everybody who joined us today, and thank you for your questions throughout. Really, really interesting to hear of what your reflections were on Simon's presentation. But I have a couple of things to share here about what's coming up next on Beyond. So as I think you'll be aware, that we're on week 3 of our 6-week training program, and Simon also previewed that he's going to be joining us again in a couple of weeks to talk about design leadership, so really excited about that. But I wanted to preview here next week. We're going to be looking at testing what works, how to rapidly test ways to adapt your services in fast changing times. And we'll be joined by that by Louise Cooper, who's innovation lead here at Shift. So that's next week, same time, Tuesday at 12 p.m. Yeah, thank you everybody again for joining, and thanks especially to Simon. Hope you all have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you all. Take care.
Bye everybody.
Bye.